This is the Books Podcast presented by Tim Hague.
Basically, I see magic as an art form rather than a science. So you get priests who like astrology but who don't approve of talismans, or you get priests who are well in favour of talismans but don't like astrology.
I ask you, gentlemen of the jury, is this the kind of book you'd like your wives and servants to read?
We're talking to Liz Williams today about her new book, Miracles of Our Own Making, A History of Paganism, which is indeed, that's what it is. It's a history of paganism. Liz, thank you for joining us on the book podcast.
Our pleasure. Thank you for having me on here.
Now, as well as being a novelist and holding a PhD in the philosophy of science, you're also a practicing pagan. And I want to call you a witch as well, but you have a preferred term for that, don't you?
Yes, I'm quite happy to be referred to as a witch, actually, because I do practice what is known as contemporary witchcraft. But in addition to that, witches as a term can be a little bit narrow. So I tend to use the term practicing British occultist, since I have an interest in the occult, since I do practice that, and since it tends to be sort of based in the practices of British magic. So I tend to use that as a slightly wider umbrella term.
Now, the book is a history of paganism. Can I establish to the beginning, is paganism a religion?
Essentially, it's an umbrella term for a kind of number of religions, a number of spiritual paths. So one of the original meanings of the term was paganus, a country dweller. It comes from the Latin. So it doesn't really have that much to do with religion. But over the years, it's kind of come to mean a sort of an umbrella term for a whole range of religions who worship more than one deity. So if you think of paganism as not being monotheistic, that's probably a good clue. And a friend of mine actually attended a Hindu temple in London for a while, and because he is white, they asked him what he was doing there, and he said that he was a pagan. And they said, well, what do pagans believe in then? And he said, well, we believe in lots of gods and goddesses. And they replied, oh, that's unusual, so do we. So we must be pagans too. And they got on very well. So it is really a term for nature-based religions and religions that have a wide pantheon.
Are people going to mix this up with witchcraft and Wicca? And you use the term cunning folk a lot. Can we tease those out and separate them?
Yes, it is very, very complicated, and I'm not surprised that people become confused because it is actually inherently confusing. So witchcraft is the practice of magic, and you can talk about witchcraft happening in a wide variety of cultural contexts and settings. You can talk about African witchcraft, for example. You can talk about Russian witchcraft. You can certainly talk about British medieval witchcraft. And it's just the practice of a certain type of magic. Now, these days, it has changed from its older meaning in a British context, because when people were accused of being witches in medieval and in medieval times and the few hundred years leading on from that, when we have what we call the witch trials, for example, then what people actually were referring to was a type of magic that did harm. So it was cursing magic. It was magic that was negative. It was magic that caused harm to other people. Now, today, we don't necessarily see witchcraft as being harmful. We see it as being a spiritual path in its own right. But the differentiation between witches and cunning folk, cunning men, cunning women, were that in the theology and some of the legal codes, actually, I think, of the time, cunning folk were seen as protecting ordinary citizens from negative magic. So if you had a curse placed on you by a witch, the cunning person would be able to remove that curse. And they didn't practice cursing themselves. Their magic was seen as more positive. It was a service industry, as I've said elsewhere. It was devoted to healing, finding lost objects, protecting people from negative magic and from harm, and a variety of other things like fortune telling and prediction. So you have there a difference between the older definition of witches and cunning folk. Nowadays, witchcraft is seen much more as the sort of cunning type magic. It's seen as positive. A lot of it's devoted towards healing, towards spiritual development. It differs from Wicca in that Wicca starts technically in the 1950s, and is seen as the religious arm of witchcraft. It's not maybe based so much on spell work, it's based on the idea of a god and a goddess whom you actually worship and to whom you do rituals. But Wicca is the modern one and much narrower. Witchcraft is a wider term. And as we've seen, you can use that in a variety of contexts, really.
We'll come back to Wicca in a minute, because I want to follow up this notion of the cunning folk. You make it clear in the book that, to a large extent, the functions of cunning folk has sort of disappeared. Their functions have been taken over by other agencies.
Yes, you find cunning folk in every aspect of history. The same sort of functions will be found in all cultures, all historical periods, all societies. The Egyptians, for example, in ancient times had magical practitioners who would do much the same thing as the medieval cunning person in England, for example. Now, the methodology changes and the theology behind it is different, but the actual purpose of the magic is the same. It's to attract a lover. It's to find something that's lost. It's to divine the future. It's to heal somebody who's sick. And there are a whole sort of range of things that fall under this magical remit. Now, we need to remember that in, say, medieval England, you didn't have the NHS. Medicine was not really very well understood. I've actually just coincidentally been listening to something about one of my ancestors, Edward Jenner, the man who developed the smallpox vaccine through cowpox. Now, that's quite late in the day. Prior to that, some of these diseases would have just run rife throughout the society, like the Black Death. And one of the only ways that you could possibly counteract it was through herbalism or through magic. Nowadays, of course, once we've got through the Victorian period, the Victorians, with their great talent for innovation, start bringing things increasingly under the role of the authorities. So we have a police force. And if you lose something, if you think it's been stolen, not if you just mislay it, obviously, they will help you find it. They'll help you track down the perpetrator. If you're ill, you go and see a doctor or a chemist or a nurse. And these methods, it has to be said, are much more reliable than magic. If I feel that I'm under the weather, I don't do a spell. I go to the doctor, or I go to Boots, or I look up the scientific causes of my malaise online. So there are many, many things that magic, as a kind of a last resort, was roped in to counteract and solve in previous years, but nowadays that's not so common. So really the role of magic these days is twofold. It's to predict the future, because despite the rise of the futurologist, we've never really found a good way of doing that. And it's to attract love. I think the bulk of the magic that people are asked to do in this country relates to love and relates to cursing.
And you're asked for love charms as well, aren't
yes,
you? Still.
Yes, we are, and it's a measure of desperation. And really, I have to say that I spend a very great deal of my time in that sort of sector of my work, talking people out of doing a spell to get their boyfriend back, because usually either they've split up for a reason, he's left because it's always a he, unfortunately. You sometimes get this with gay men, but mainly I'm afraid it's women. And sometimes the boyfriend is just a psychopath. You don't want him back. So I go through all this and say, really, really, working on yourself, going to see a psychologist or a therapist is actually a much better way of addressing your relationship issues than going to a practicing magician.
How effective do you find the magic? Does it work for you?
Yes, it does. There's a huge issue, and I have addressed this in a series of articles for The Guardian some years ago, as to whether this is an actual non-scientific and non-scientifically amenable and accessible form of cause and effect, or whether it's the perception of coincidence. And that's or whether it's something else, whether it's an act of imagination, like an art form towards the narrative that is your life. Now, that's a really big question, which is a fascinating question, actually. We possibly don't have time to go into it too much today, but I think it's well worth bearing in mind that there are a number of reasons why people perceive magic as working. And some of them aren't naivete and gullibility. They are slightly less obvious ways of apprehending the world and reality. if that makes sense.
And of course, it can be performative. I'm well known to be a dry as dust skeptic. I make Richard Dawkins look like the Dalai Lama,
Right.
but I can see how even if I don't believe in the practice of magic, the practitioner does,
Yeah.
and there is a performative element to that. That where as far as people believe in it,
Yes,
then it will have an effect.
yes. I mean, there is also the possibility of a placebo effect, and we see that with things like homeopathy, which I have found for myself to be very, very effective. And I can't rationally believe in this. I do take a scientific approach to medicine. There's absolutely no reason why. Excuse me, if you can hear a funny noise in the background, it is the dog. Will you excuse me one moment
Yes, of course.
while I'll just throw something at the dog. Dog, will you stop it? A large dog and noisy. So yes, so it's probably more like a placebo effect in some cases, I suspect, than anything else. But it does definitely have a feature of the performative about it. And there are some examples of cunning people. Many of these were just sort of people who had ordinary jobs as well. I mean, they were sailors, they were merchants, they were publicans quite often. Publicans get to hear all sorts of stuff. It's quite a good job to have if you're a magician and you keep your ear to the ground, being cynical. But some of these people really played up to the idea of the popular magical practitioner, and they would have a crystal ball. You would enter a dark room. The man would be dressed in robes with mystical sigils all over them, that sort of thing. So there is a setup of entering into a kind of theatrical space, I think.
This is a fantastically sensible book because, of course, it is a history as much as anything else, as well as a discussion of the nature of these matters. It's also a very entertaining book, and one of the things I liked about it is that you make clear that magic is not necessarily an ancient thing. We tend to look back to the ancients because we always think that they knew stuff that we didn't, and yet the magic of Wicca was developed by a man called Gerald Gardner, only in the last century, or the century before. Hang on, where are we?
We're all losing track of time these days.
Yes. So tell me about him, and why is it that magic can be generated, as it were, spontaneously by somebody who is on the spot within recent memory?
Well, he's a fascinating man, Gerald Gardner. I mean, when you go back through the history of magic, a definite personality type begins to emerge. And I would say that regrettably, an awful lot of these people are probably somewhere on the sociopathic spectrum because they have certain characteristics. They're immensely charismatic. They're usually highly intelligent. Their morality and ethics are, to say the least, ever so slightly lacking. Alex Sanders is one of these people. Aleister Crowley is one of these people. Gurdjieff is, Madame Blavatsky is. There's a whole range of people whom really you're fascinated to read about, but you wouldn't necessarily want to know. Gardner's not quite in that sort of category because he did have quite a strong set of ethics, but he did have a sense of the mischievous, and he was playful and creative. I mean, we're talking about a retired tea planter, absolutely a figure of the British establishment. He'd been out in Malaysia, I think, for quite a long time, conducting his trade, and he retired back to the New Forest, which is when he started becoming interested in British folklore, British magic, and met a group whom he says he believed were an ancient coven who had been going for perhaps hundreds of years. Now, I don't think he did. So I think he was either, as a good friend of mine says, colouring things bright, which is a much more polite form of saying making stuff up, and or he was just being creative and telling a story that he thought would be compelling, or he was being mischievous. It's really hard to know. It's possible he actually believed that somebody had told him that they had been going for hundreds of years, but I really don't think he was told that because we know some of the people he was associating with, and they were very much pillars of the local community. They were involved in theatrical groups and amateur dramatics, and several of them had been affiliated with the great big Victorian engine of magical practice, the Golden Dawn. So the magic wasn't really folklore, although I think they did take some stuff from local folklore and mixed and matched a bit. But the engine of Wicca is really the Golden Dawn, and prior to that, Masonic practice, because Gardner was a Mason too, and Rosicrucianism. So no, he didn't really stumble across an ancient coven who had been practicing a pagan religion in the New Forest for generations. I really don't believe that, and I don't think he believed it either.
Well,
I think he was being a little bit naughty.
something that you make that you sort of cleared up for me, which I mean, I'd always been a little unhappy about is, of course, for pagans, magic isn't tied to particular deities, which is why it's possible to have different traditions and different sources, but for it still to be meaningful. For pagans, magic isn't necessarily a religious thing, is it?
No, it isn't. No, it's not necessary to believe in a god or a goddess at all. Wiccans generally do. A lot of Druids don't. Quite a lot of witches don't, and occultists very often do not. They see it as something that is a kind of creative experimental act, and it's not necessary to tie it into any form of religion, actually. And in fact, some occultists, I would say, are quite opposed to the idea of a religion. They don't like the idea of sort of bending the knee to a higher force, and they would rather, take that sort of very individualistic approach towards it.
Another thing that you cleared up is that we always had the sense that Christianity was the implacable enemy of magic and paganism and witchcraft. And you argue for a reversal of the popular assumptions, and that Christianity sat actually quite comfortably with paganism in the Middle Ages. Why are we wrong about that?
Well, it's I would issue a small correction in that it didn't sit comfortably with paganism, but it did sit comfortably with magic, because we need to tease out the distinction between magical practice and paganism. So paganism in this country dies out round about the sort of Saxon and Viking periods. Britain becomes Christianized, and quite why that remains to be seen. There are lots and lots of historical surmises about why Britain changed from being a pagan country to being a Christian country, but it did change. And some of those practices probably just kind of got subsumed into the early church, because when we have things like some of the Saxon charms, if you look at them in the original Anglo-Saxon, they call upon the gods like Odin and Loki and Thor. And if you look at them a few hundred years later, it's the same wording, but the Holy Spirit, Jesus and Mary.
Yeah.
So, people basically just think, oh, that's nice, or that worked, or my granddad did that, but he was some mad old pagan, so I'm not going to do that because we're all Christian now. So we just change the words. It doesn't really matter. They're all the same gods in a way. They're all the same thing. So it was much more flexible about taking magic on. And say about the sort of 12 or 1300s, a lot of the time, if you wanted actually what we would consider to be spell work undertaking, you would go to your local priest and he would do something for you. It might be couched as praying, and it might be couched as speaking to the saints rather than to a pagan deity. In fact, it certainly wouldn't be speaking to a pagan deity, but that is nonetheless what he would do. And this isn't a sort of uniform block, because a lot of clerics disapproved, and some of them disapproved of some things and not of others. So you get priests who like astrology but who don't approve of talismans, or you get priests who are well in favour of talismans but don't like astrology, for example. So it's very much individualistic, and it's not really until the Reformation, when the Puritans start sort of cracking down on the whole lot, seeing Catholicism as almost worse than witchcraft.
Well, of course, the Catholics still practice magic, don't they? They speak a magic spell over a wafer and turn it into the body of a dead rabbi. So, I mean, it's not like magic has disappeared from mainstream religion.
And a lot of prayers to the saints really resemble spells. And when you start looking at things like voodoo and hoodoo and the use of folk saints who aren't necessarily sanctioned by the Vatican, but I think they're still very much within the Catholic tradition, that is absolutely straightforward magic, very definitely. But it's the Puritans who really kind of put the mockers on practicing magic, and they see it as all superstition. A lot of Catholicism is superstition, magic is superstition. But when we look at some of the Pendle witches, Alice Nutter, for example, is a very unfortunate name. I think Terry Pratchett used it.
Yes,
but
he
she
did.
was quite a respectable. She wasn't some mad old hag. She was some, really quite respectable landowner. Had a row with the magistrate next door who coveted her lands, and couldn't explain where she was on a crucial evening. And he basically put it that she was at some kind of satanic coven ceremony, but she wouldn't say where she was. And she was probably a Catholic recusant and was at a mass, but the mass would have been illegal, and she didn't say so because she would have been dropping her fellow members of her congregation in it. And she paid the ultimate price, which was death. But she wasn't a witch, almost certainly.
Some strands of magic are more popular now than other ones. Which are they, and why is it that some have fallen out of favour?
So it's definitely fortune telling. Nobody can reliably predict the future. I am also a science fiction writer. Science fiction writers are terrible at predicting the future. We don't seem to sort of take on things like miniaturization, for example. And everybody on a personal basis, some people really don't know what's going to happen and say that it will just worry them. But some people are actually quite keen to know what's going to come down the pike. And so tarot reading is very popular. Astrology remains very popular. And sometimes it's just a fun pastime. And sometimes when people get a bit desperate, they do place a lot of store in it. If I have a tarot client, they're going to be one of two types of people. They're either on holiday and they want a reading done because they think it's interesting and it's fun. They've never had one before, perhaps. Or they are actually desperate. They need to know where's my health going to go? Where's my relationship going to go? Am I going to lose my job? Am I going to get another job? All of those sorts of things. So fortune telling is a big one. Love magic, as we've discussed, is another big one. And there are, in other traditions, Gerald Gardner actually did a really good job of putting the lid on all this in Wicca by essentially taking from, I think, Robert Cochrane, the idea that there would be a threefold return on your evil act. So if you curse somebody under Wicca, it's supposed to come back to you 3 times. Now, this is manifestly, obviously not the case, because otherwise, terrible people in this world would be having dreadful things happen to them, and they usually don't, unfortunately. Source of great gall to me, but there again, life's not fair. And so, but the threefold law was taken very seriously by a lot of Wiccans and still is. So they don't do the sort of cursing type magic. They generally don't go around putting curses on people, which is a good thing. It's basically a civilized form of behavior not to do that kind of stuff. But other traditions, not so much. So if you go to a hoodoo practitioner or a candomblé practitioner, a similar type of magic practiced in South America, if you go to witches in the Philippines or in Southeast Asia, they will put curses on people for you. And we've seen that in practice. Some of them bring it over here. There are types of Islamic magic in this country. People don't like talking about that, and the Islamic community keep very, very quiet about it. But sometimes it does bubble up that you can go to a particular mosque and the imam there is also essentially a magician.
What sort of welcome do you get from mainstream society then? I think I'm right in saying you live in Glastonbury, so mainstream society is going to be a little more sympathetic there. And you even ran a witchcraft shop, didn't you?
Yes, and I have to say I've had very, very few problems from anybody ever really about this. You hear of shops being targeted and by Christians. We haven't been. We're on very good terms with the local vicar. We have regular dinner dates, and we get on generally well with the clergy. We've got quite a large number of clerical friends, a couple of friends who are involved in the Judaic faith and who are Jewish. And really, I had very few problems. And I'm quite open about it because you can't, unfortunately, run a witchcraft shop and expect people not to notice. So when I go out to, for example, trade shows, which we don't do so much, or science fiction conventions, or religious conferences, which I sometimes do, or basically writing groups, I am pretty upfront about it. But I've never had any kind of negative comeback. And I suspect that is largely because I hope I am well-spoken. I am definitely middle class. I have a nasty look in my eye. And I think people just don't go there. If I was lower class, I think I might get some comeback. If I was black, different question. I think I may well get a certain amount of resistance. But in general, people are sometimes amused. Sometimes they make jokes. That's fine. Quite a lot of the time they're curious and they have quite interesting questions to ask. But I've never actually directly had a confrontation with anybody over my faith.
One of the things I liked about your book is the no-nonsense attitude to the flakier varieties of magic, and also that you're very happy with pop expressions of magic in the culture. You know, Dennis Wheatley and Harry Potter and Buffy the Vampire Slayer, Brother Cadfael, even the Marvel comic universe and the Da Vinci Code. You regard those as legitimate strands of expression of this subculture.
Yes, I think it is basically I see magic as an art form rather than a science. And I think a lot of the material of popular culture does sort of bubble up from the unconscious, and it allows people to express their current concerns, their need for heroes, their need for saviors, their need for something beyond strict rationality. Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, I think that there is definitely a need for it. And popular culture gives it that. It's entertaining. It takes you out of the mundane world and out of the mundane reality and into another potentially more interesting reality. And there's a very strong emphasis in popular culture, whether it's Dennis Wheatley or whether it's Marvel Comics or whoever it is really, that good triumphs over evil, that justice is done. Now, we know for a fact in the world that this is often not the case. But I think there is a desire to see that in a great many people. And so that's all a reflection of that same thing. There's also the idea of control, which is that quite a lot of the time you don't have a lot of control over your life. You know, suddenly the government might impose a lockdown because there's a global pandemic. You know, who knew? Where is your control then? You know, somebody said to me, if one of those awful job interviews where they say in 2015, and where do you see yourself in 5 years' time? You know, this wouldn't be it. This is an unusual set of circumstances. And magic, I think, appeals to a lot of people because it's seen as giving you a tiny bit more control back over your life. That may be totally erroneous, but the desire is there.
Well, I'm going to finally invite you to step away from your extremely good-natured and rather sweet-natured attitude to all these things and ask you about New Age practitioners. How do pagans view the New Agers? Do you think they're as flaky as I do?
Yeah, generally, pagans tend to see New Agers as a bit fluffy, a bit sort of love and light, and relying on things like the angelic powers. Which, if you go back to the Bible, angels are absolutely terrifying. You know, there is a reason why people fall to their knees with awe when they're confronted with these entities, and so I think they do see them as a little bit flaky. They also take a look at some of the money involved in the New Age. And I mean, the money side of it is absolutely phenomenal. You know, you get these Californian workshops and cults, they're charging thousands of dollars. It's a lot of money behind it. And I think the level of cynicism in the New Age is higher. You get more cynical practitioners in the New Age than you do in modern paganism. Paganism doesn't have a lot of money, unfortunately, she said, generated by it. And, we'd make far more if we went to California and purported to be, I don't know, the descendants of ancient druids who had mystical lore from the island of Avalon. You know, we could probably make a fortune, but could I look myself in the mirror every morning? Probably not, actually. So, yeah, there's a definite attitude of wariness and disdain towards the New Age from the pagan community, although there are quite a lot of crossover practices, you know, like the tarot, for example, like astrology.
But there are always going to be charlatans and frauds within all of these traditions. And there must be in magic as well.
Yes, there are some really dodgy people. There are some dodgy people around now, and there have certainly been some dodgy people in the past. You know, as I mentioned, sociopathic spectrum. Quite a few magical practitioners would have been very iffy, really, I think, verging on the criminal.
Liz, thank you very much. I feel I know a little bit more than I did before I started reading the book, which is always a good thing. And I really enjoyed it. It's very entertaining and useful advice in it as well. We've been talking about Liz Williams' Miracles of Our Own Making a History of Paganism, which is published by Reaction Books at $15.99. Thank you very much.
A pleasure. Thank you, Tim.
That was Books Podcast, presented by Tim Haig. Books Podcast is a Green Shoot production. You can find out more at www.green-shoot.com, and Tim can be contacted on tim@green-shoot.com.